Hello, I'm Kara Nortman. I am a partner at Upfront who focuses on many things, including infrastructure, cybersecurity, and in particular, cloud-native cybersecurity. We're joined today by three of the top CEOs I've had a pleasure to get to know in my career, who also all happen to be based in Southern California, our budding community. Art Poghosyan, Dave Cole, and Andrew Peterson, all of who've been a part of some of the fastest growing cloud and cyber companies you've all heard of. And so I'm just going to hand it over to each one of them to touch on an introduction. And we, again, have the good fortune of investing in both Art and Dave, and maybe someday Andrew.
Sure. Dave Cole, CEO, co-founder of OpenRaven, 25-year cybersecurity veteran, formerly of Symantec, CrowdStrike, Tenable, and so on.
Andrew Peterson, recovering CEO and founder of a company called Signal Sciences, got acquired by a company called Fastly. I'm working there now and still learning from folks like Dave and Art as much as I can in the cybersecurity space.
A pleasure to be in this great company. Art Poghosyan, CEO and co-founder of Britive, the cloud-native identity and privileged access management solution for all the new cloud-native technologies. With, my background in cybersecurity started in early 2000 and primarily focused on the enterprise space for identity and access management solutions.
Well, thank you guys for being here. One of the things I love about spending time with all of you guys is your humility relative to what you've all accomplished, which is not something we always see. Ambition and humility together is a wonderful recipe. So I think we're going to get into a bunch of themes that you guys have all built and are building companies around. But maybe just to sort of set the stage, it's obviously it's a very dynamic time in cyber, in cloud, and all of the areas related to those two areas. Maybe just set the stage on why now is a great time to start a cybersecurity company. You know, if you'd like to talk a little bit about the crazy funding environment going into companies right now, which are maybe indicative of why it's a great time to start a cybersecurity company.
I'll kick it off. You know, it's there's a lot of changes that are happening around technology in general that I think lend themselves to what the opportunity is around cybersecurity and building a cybersecurity company. But like these are also, you know, opportunities for attackers, right? Like this is a world that's sort of different about cybersecurity, that's different from a lot of other sort of infrastructure companies that you probably look at. Is that like we have an adversary on the other side that we're trying to go against, and the opportunities for the defensive side, especially on the security component, they're born from the opportunities for the attackers on the attacking side. And so when there's companies, you know, we talk about cloud, we talk about DevOps, there's new stuff like DevSecOps, like those words sort of come up a bunch. But I think the reality of what that basically means is that there's just a ton of adoption of new types of software, new types of technologies, new types of platforms that people aren't terribly familiar with how to actually protect both the data that's being created there and then also the actual technology that's being created through the process of that. And so, you know, I feel like we've been talking cloud and DevOps for a very long time, but it's really just now permeating through most of what I call mainstream adoption. And so I think the opportunities are bigger now than they've ever been.
Thanks, Andrew. And Dave, I was going to pop it over to you as someone who kind of grew up in the network security space and now in the data security space. What was the why now for you as to starting OpenRaven?
Yeah, it's everything that Andrew said. I mean, the refresh cycles on tech are just so profound now, and people are buying best of breed. So you don't have to have a massive conglomeration of technology. You just have to do one thing and do it really, really well. And the old story of, oh, we'll do all the things for you, Symantec and McAfee and now others peddled. No one believes that anymore. And they just expect you to integrate with APIs. So that kind of lowers the barrier for what you have to do. And then if you look at it, I mean, you know, back in my day, in the early days of cyber, you know, we didn't have fancy things like, hey, if I buy this, I can get a better rate on my cyber insurance. You know, like that's a new thing, and it's kind of awesome to be able to have a business impact. I mean, so it's cliche to say it, but like the general awareness and security making its way to the boardroom means that as a cybersecurity company, you have a lot more awareness and you've got the headlines to piggyback off of now. Wow, if you didn't have that before and you have it now, you never take that for granted. When I took my first job in cyber, like my boss looked at me at the time, he's like, "What are you doing, man? Why don't you get into a better space?" No one said that for a long time now.
Yeah. Yeah, no, and that's a great tip, Art, for you as well. I think one of the interesting stats I've come across recently is that about 6% of IT spend in the on-prem world is spent on what's considered cybersecurity, whereas right now it's 1% in the cloud world. So you have a natural expansion there. And then, in a way, and we can maybe get into this later, all three of you build sort of cloud native solutions where you could argue whether security is the reason people buy or the reason people stay, right? And so you can see massive market expansion as more and more is moving over to the cloud. But we have a lot of market creation just by catching up to the on-prem world. And so, Art, you sit in one of those spaces, identity and access management, where you've been for a decade or two. How do you view the startup world kind of landscape and the opportunity for a company like Britive today?
That's a great question. Sure. I think a lot of what was said already by Dave and Andrew kind of plays into that quite a bit. I think what we're also seeing in the past, at least the 5 years, is this very rapid acceleration. In the cloud native technologies and the kind of change, the new types of architectures. So the reality today is very different from the reality even from 5 years ago. The cloud, and I'm speaking even the cloud, environments, the public cloud environments, right? So we're seeing a lot more of these, convergence of, functionality and capabilities across, clouds, platforms, and applications, and anything else in between. And that drives quite a bit of complexity. The complexity that is kind of been very, unfamiliar to the businesses, to the enterprises that are running business in that complexity. I'll give you an example. Several of our customers are, architecting their, multi-cloud environments where, data layer runs on Google GCP versus the compute runs in AWS or Azure. And there's a lot of other pieces and components to that. So this level of complexity is completely new and is completely different from anything that I had to deal with before. And that's why, when we looked at this, from the standpoint of, how, from an enterprise standpoint, how do you mitigate the risks and how do you mitigate the operational complexity of where you operate in this new environment? There's not been much, done yet in the space. So Britive is one technology that, at least from the security standpoint, is bringing the much needed consistency in control across this very sort of the diverse and very complex architectures that modern businesses are operating in.
Yeah, terrific. I guess one last thing before we get into some of the trends. I think it's interesting the way you guys are laid out on my screen. I could almost describe how your products all interact and hand off to each other. But you guys will do a better job of that than I do. Dave, maybe do you want to just give everyone kind of the 30-second version of what OpenRaven does and how you would work with a Britive or a Signal Sciences? I think it's interesting to piece kind of the startup best of breed world together for the audience.
Yeah, sure. When we started OpenRaven, the problem that we kept hearing from people is they couldn't answer the fundamental questions about their data. Where's my data at inside the cloud? What data is where? Data classification is something a lot of people have talked about, but never really completed. And then how's it being protected? Is it being protected in a way that's appropriate to the data? And, you'd see incident after incident, breach after breach, exposure, and people wasting time on that, time that they don't have, chasing this stuff down when it's just far too easy for people to make mistakes and expose their data in the cloud. So at OpenRaven, we endeavor to be the company where you can ask and answer all the hard questions about your data and ensure that it's protected in the right way. That's especially personal data, what is before times was called PII. Now it's fashionable called personal data, customer data, developer secrets, you name it. Historically, we just simply haven't had visibility into that in the security space. And like Andrew was saying, the technology changes lately have been profound, particularly with the dawn of serverless technology. Now it's possible, even inside a massive, AWS S3 based data lake, to classify it and to understand things at petabyte scale.
Terrific.
Just to follow up on that, like why is it so hard to keep track of all the data? Like why is securing it properly such a challenge?
Yeah, I think the big thing is the number of people touching the data today, how much of it there is and how fast it's changing. Think back to like 10 years ago when data was predominantly on-prem. You had a database administrator and largely they were the gatekeeper to your data. Now think of the data science team, the marketers, the salespeople, the POC environment where you have customer data that gets spun up and accidentally left there and goes radioactive when you're not looking. The sheer amount of data, just look at Snowflake's market cap. It's a good indication of how much data out there and how it's growing. It's just there's simply too much of it and too many people touching it. And on top of that, you put in the regulatory environment and all of the business intelligence tools and the different way it flows across the environment. The bad guy here isn't, the people, it isn't North Korea. The bad guy is crazy chaos and entropy and just the sheer importance of data and everything else that follows. And people who just need to get stuff done. It's just far too easy to make a mistake. And I think, to get down technical for a moment, you can have an AWS S3 bucket that's closed off to the internet and encrypted, and an object inside of it that's unencrypted and visible to the internet. That's why people are making mistakes. The collision of kind of secure by design with messy reality, like the secure by design doesn't survive.
Yeah, I think, I just think to drive that home, and I had the good fortune of sitting in a board meeting today, so I'm pretty fresh with OpenRaven's data. 10 years ago, we were not talking about billions of files and petabytes of data and, test data that's sitting up there spun up by one engineer and a credit card that you don't know exists. And things of that nature. We were talking about firewalls and VPNs, et cetera, et cetera. And so, I mean, maybe, I guess one last question for Dave, and then we'll kind of move a little bit more into Andrew and Art's world. How do you, pull the signal from the noise in a world where you have that much data sitting out there in environments? And where do you start? Where do you start looking first to have impact from a commercial standpoint?
Yeah, the first thing, and one of the things that we do that's a little unique, is we just assume you don't know where your data is. And if you frame it and you start with the right question and you kind of draw the boundaries of where data is, which, oh, by the way, is part of the way Experian got hacked, right? There was stuff sitting there they simply didn't know about. Drawing the boundaries and mapping what you have, essential first step. And if you start with the presumption that there might be something that you don't know, and you make sure that you know what's out there, right place to start. And then from there, inventory and classification. You can't afford to care about, the hundreds of millions in objects in an enterprise environment. There's no way, just like you can't afford to worry about all of the alerts that you get inside a security operations center. What you have to do is winnow them down using automation, using heuristics. And candidly, on this side, on the data protection side, that's data classification. And then that's using rules and order to get it down to the things that you can really care about. We're quickly getting to the point where people realize with old school, cloud security posture management products where they, say, oh my God, you have an open S3 bucket. And people are now kind of attuned to it and saying, yeah, but that's marketing content. Like that's okay. Get down to the data. I'm too busy. Just give me the stuff that matters.
Yeah.
Well, and Spencer, to your question, by the way, like, asking David sort of why is right now like the right time for that work. And Dave and Art can probably speak to this way better than I can, but it's not like, Carrie, you were saying 10 years ago, we didn't have hundreds of thousands or hundreds of millions of files. It's not like we were good at data security then though. Like we've never been good. These are problems that have been exacerbated because we're leaning into using technology more. But my space that we've been in, and I'll talk about it very briefly, but the space is protecting websites and web applications. Well, we've had websites since the 90s, like, and we've had protections for websites since the 90s. Our thing is just like, look, it's not like the products that were built then weren't perfect, just like the products that are built now aren't perfect, but there's been so much more adoption and there's so much more risk that's associated with the volume and the way people are using these to drive the businesses that they have behind this data. Like, that's the piece that's incredibly risky and urgent for most businesses now, is about, like, again, Carrot, to your point, like 10 years ago, Intuit, like, as a company, they sell box top software through Best Buy. Like, you bought that stuff and you installed it on your computer on a CD-ROM, and now almost all of their business is done via their website. Like, all of the products are accessed through that. So, like, they had a website before, they had protection for that website before, but their whole business is now about data. It's about identity and access through those web portals, and that's why it's very different now than it was before.
Just want to add, just real quick, right? So all of that, agreed 100%. And the other thing that really adds to this complexity is who. Andrew just kind of hinted on that identity. So you can add, now the data is everywhere, but then also the actors, the users of that data have become a lot more different and diverse than we knew. For example, we talked more today about APIs, machine identities, robotic processes. All these things act like humans or users. All these things have access to it, and they copy, transfer, and so on data. So it's a completely different world now.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things I always think about in venture capital is when I was a 23-year-old associate in a dark, cold office in Boston working for a firm called Battery Ventures, and the founder of the firm said, I funded this exact same company 15 years ago. And to me, I have that experience all the time now when I'm seeing, DevOps or cyber companies being funded. I actually shot one over to a friend of mine the other day who we were associates together in 1999. And we were, we were involved in funding a company called At Stake. If you guys remember that firm back in the day, like Mudge.
Dave, do you remember that firm at all?
But I sent it to one of my former colleagues there, and I said, I think At Stake just got funded again. They're using AI in the description, and they've raised $100 million, but it's basically, kind of emulating red teams with both kind of AI and probably ML actually, and human beings to find vulnerabilities. And so, what's old is new again. And I think that's another interesting time we saw a full venture capital fund emerge the other day that's just going to fund cloud services firms, like professional services firms that are going to integrate in, cloud native solutions and cyber solutions. And so this is sort of, these are some interesting kind of repeat trends we're seeing. But I wanted to ask you one quick follow-up, Art, and then I'll come back to you, Andrew, on identity. Identity is obviously kind of the glue and touches data and a bunch of other things. Explain to, and one of the questions that comes up all the time is when you're starting as a startup, when we fund companies, sometimes we're the first couple $1 million in, is it a point solution or is it a platform? And maybe just explain to the world, what does Okta do and what do you do that's different than Okta, who I think is thought of as the iconic identity company on the cloud?
Sure, yeah. So now Okta, it's been in the market for about 10 years now, 10, 11 years now. And when they came to market, concepts like single sign-on and authentication were not new, been around. What they did really well was to consolidate that, the version 1 of the identity for the cloud, really. And they became kind of that identity directory for many cloud applications, mainly SaaS, that, without Okta, you'd have to kind of have logins into every single application. I think of Okta as kind of the cloud identity version 1. And that cloud identity for that stage of the cloud was great. It worked well. They built a multi-billion-dollar business based on that. What we see today, again, a lot of it is because of what we said before, the complexity and how the operational aspect of this cloud, cloud architectures has become a risk and a vulnerability. That identity version 1.0 for the cloud is no longer enough. And we saw a glimpse of that in the SolarWinds breach. So identity plus whatever is other pieces that are missing in the cloud is the next version of identity for the cloud. So if you look at what Britive does today is we are essentially converging very important critical elements with the security elements with the identity, such as analytics, such as the secrets management, such as the dynamic privilege and permissioning of identities across these cloud technologies. And so that's really where we think the next version of cloud identity is, and that's what we're building.
Awesome. So Andrew, I was going to go back over to you. DevSecOps. First of all, I think we need a new term. Anyone have one? You know, maybe we can come up with one by the end of.
Pure DevOps, SecDevOps.
I'm on a mission to create plain language. I like personal, you know, what is it? Personal, we've moved from PII to a term that people can understand. But anyway, DevSecOps, I sort of think of it as preventative medicine in a way, where cybersecurity used to be did the bad guys get behind a firewall or not? And if they did, how do you get them out? Whereas now it's, you know, I think we're trying to get to how do you start from the beginning to leverage the power of the cloud and have developers care about security? Where do you think we are? Like, we VCs love to think it's happening. Where do you think we are in that trend? And, you know, yeah, maybe I'll just leave it there. Where do you think we are in that trend?
I mean, it's happening. Like, it's absolutely happening. And I think, yeah, I think it's important to be concerned or be aware of the echo chamber that is the tech industry. Because I think you talk to the tech industry and it's like, oh, cloud's over. Like we're way past that at this point, right? And you talk to folks that are working at any Fortune 500 company, and the reality is, like, you're just not seeing a lot of lift and shift still. Like, so 90%, you know, sometimes up to 90% of people's infrastructure is still hardware. It's still on-prem. And I think, like, the thing that I love to point out to folks is that, like, when people say cloud, they tend to mean things like Kubernetes or things, you know, new types of service mesh or whatever. Kubernetes can be run on hardware just like it can be run in cloud, and it is run on hardware just as much, if not more now, than it's run in the cloud. And so I think there's a lot of words that get conflated. So I think your point about, like, we need a new term for this stuff, I don't think it's wrong, but I think it's just, this kind of gets back to Art's point that he was making before, and a little bit about Dave's point, but it's complex now. There's so many more, like, architectures that are being used. I was at this meetup, a security meetup down in Austin, Texas, about a year and a half ago. And I was talking to people about a LAMP stack and saying that, like, people don't use a LAMP stack anymore. And that's, you know, Linux, Apache, PHP, I think it's just, no, and MySQL, right? And one of the younger developers in the room kind of raised their hand. And they're like, "I'm sorry, what's LAMP stack?" And everybody's like, "Are you kidding?" Like, but they're not, like, because that doesn't exist. Like, LAMP stack doesn't exist anymore for the new stuff that's being built, because there's so many different components that go into building an application. And as Art said, like, it's not even that, like, I saw some architecture where you're using, you know, Microsoft's backend for one piece of your logic, you're using Google's backend for your AI, and you're using, you know, Oracle for your database sometimes. And yeah, I think it's DevSecOps it's sort of reinventing itself in every iteration of what people are using it as. And I think it's just kind of a moniker for people are using and starting to use newer and newer architectures, rather than it actually has some very specific definition. And most of, I think, what that gets back to is, again, a point that Dave said, which is everything's just speeding up. Like, the amount of change, the amount of access that people have to be able to make the changes in their architecture and the technology stacks that they're using to deliver mission critical and business critical applications, like, that is expanding. It's not contracting. Like, we're not at a convergent point. We're diverging right now in terms of where like the stacks look. So we're far from the next iteration of what LAMP looks like. I think we're still pretty far from that.
I wanted to go to cloud a little bit. And Art and Dave, when we were discussing cloud, there's references to multi-cloud a few times. But Dave, as you're meeting with companies who are either far along in their journey or just starting out, are you seeing is multi-cloud environment the norm at this point, or is that just industry speak, or what are you seeing primarily?
Yeah, it's sadly the norm, but nobody asked for it. You know, it's where you end up, but not necessarily like what you set out to do. It's that classic thing of like, well, we're an AWS shop, and then you make an acquisition that happens to be in GCP or Azure, or you get fancy, like Art described, and you end up in a situation where you get quite sophisticated and you realize like, oh my God, like it's way better to store this data in Google because, BigQuery can handle it over there, whereas it can't in AWS. And it starts to make sense. No one in their right mind, given the complexity of multi-cloud, goes out saying, you know what, it'd be awesome, multi-cloud. You just kind of end up there. It's sort of like Denny's. Kidding, sort of. But it's just painful. It's super painful, but it's also unavoidable. And, there's also, like Andrew was saying, there's this mythology that the end state of digital transformation is everything in the cloud. I think the vast majority of things end up there due to economics and ease and everything else. But having said that, like at CrowdStrike, when we got really mature, we realized a real cost savings moving stuff back on-prem. One of our advisors at a major internet company moved stuff back on-prem for a cost saving. So our future is not necessarily everything in the cloud. Our future is mind-numbing complexity, apparently. Self-inflicted mind-numbing complexity. And, yes, we still may end up at Denny's. Maybe that's the right answer to all this. Like, go have a moons over my hammy.
We all need that.
And Dave, if there are any entrepreneurs who are starting companies watching this, where would you advise them to start if they want to build for a multi-cloud world? How do you think about where to start?
Yeah, I think it's a combination of kind of holding two things that are very different, both simultaneously in your mind. One is architect knowing that at some point you're going to have to support every cloud. And then once you've realized you haven't designed yourself in a corner, and you can convince yourself you haven't designed yourself in a corner, maybe by testing your prototype and your data model, then promptly forget about all those other clouds and do a really good job in one of them, because people will give you permission to go and solve their problem in other clouds after you've done a really good job in one of the clouds. If you do a crappy job across all the clouds, no one wants to hire you to do the job in any of those other places. And app, it's so easy to do Apple examples, but behind this is an element of consumer psychology where, like, I bought the Apple Watch sight unseen because I'd had such a great experience with the iPhone. That same kind of mentality plays with products. If you do a great job in one area, people will assume you can cross over to related things. If you don't, and you spread yourself thin, you won't get credit and you won't get permission to do anything else.
Yeah, and a quick follow-up, either Andrew or Art, add in on-prem. Do you have anything to add to advice to an entrepreneur around how to think about a go-to-market in a multi-cloud and on-prem world, where to build first?
Go ahead, Art.
Well, so I'm very biased in that respect, because that's the decision we made when we started Britive. We decided to focus 100% on the cloud, and cloud meaning cloud private as well as public cloud. But on-prem for us was kind of really the world that has been is being addressed. It's from the solution, the product standpoint, there is a lot more options there. Cloud is where I would say, focus your time and energy, at least in the near term.
Yeah, a quick follow-up. I'd just say, like, to Dave's point, think about it from an architecture standpoint. And obviously, like, most of the new technology is being born or built in the cloud, but there's a whole lot of old school technology that's still not in the cloud yet, and probably will never be. And there might even be a movement at some point back off the cloud. So it's more of, you got to start somewhere and focus. I think that's kind of both what Art and Dave were saying, but I also think, like, if you can think about it from an architecture standpoint early on, so that you can have some flexibility as you build, it gives you the ability to be able to not have to, essentially deal with a ton of tech debt to be able to actually serve customers' needs across things. I will just tell you, like, from our experience, we were able to install our product either in a cloud environment or in customers' hardware, and that proved to be a really big differentiator. Like especially as we were getting into the mainstream, where they said, "Hey, look, like we have to be able to install in these situations and these scenarios because that's still 60% of my infrastructure." So when you do it, I think that's the bigger question. It's not sort of if you ever do it, it's when you actually get to it.
Terrific.
One more quick thing, Kara. I think it's also very important, focus, yes, but also spend plenty of time defining the problem and learning about the problem. Because I think there are a lot of startups and entrepreneurs out there. They think they have a solution for a problem, but that problem oftentimes is not a real problem.
Yeah. No, I think one of the things you guys have in common, and you guys didn't all fully mention this in your background, but, Andrew decided to start his company after, building things at Etsy where he lived it on the other side. Dave was, the head of product for 2 companies from small to big that went public, Tenable, CrowdStrike, and then Art, integrated in identity and access management solutions for a decade. And I think, one of the things you guys all have in common is you really like lived the inside of not just how do you build something that looks good in TechCrunch, but how do you make sure it gets implemented and used? And I think we end up with a lot of shelfware in these areas, and all big platforms, I think, start with point solutions that just crush it in the point and then move out into the platform. And it's sometimes hard to keep the focus in the early days when you have customers who want you to do on-prem and multi-cloud from the start, but nobody's doing that well. So, and I think you guys all exemplify that. So I'm going to go into sort of like one last big question and then a lightning round. I guess the big one is in a lot of ways, this is something I struggle with myself. Am I a cybersecurity investor, or am I an IT and DevOps investor who tries to sneak cybersecurity into data and device management and identity companies? And it really goes to who is your buyer and how is that changing? How is the CISO role changing? Are you guys selling to the CISO? Are you selling to different kinds of people than you have in the past? I'd love for you guys just each, and maybe we'll start with you, Andrew, and then go Dave and Art, just to kind of walk through how your buyer has changed over the last decade, if at all.
So I'll be quick, but I've lots of thoughts on this if people want to go into depth on this in a later session. But the quick version is, especially if you're selling into anything that's sort of DevSecOps, if you ask somebody like, "Hey, who's your buyer?" and they say, "Oh, it's like one thing," and they try to give you a simple answer, like that's BS. Like it is muddy right now. There's lots of different buyers through the process. Some of them are CTOs, some of them are CISOs, some of them are developers and they just buy it from the ground up. Some of them it's still top down. It is a messy environment right now, but if you're not playing in the mud, like you're not going to figure it out, because that's like essentially like you have to sort of muddy the water, because there's not a direct way to be able to sell to that buyer set. The downside is it makes it complex. There's lots of different potential people that you can sell to, a lot of potential people that have to say yes. The upside is that if you strike out with one group and they're not feeling the pain of what you're solving, you can go to another group and sell to them as well and still be able to get into the same company. So I suggest to people, if you're looking to build a product or market it into this area, just have stick-to-itiveness and like know that you're getting into a space that like it's not fully figured out who the buyer is and how to market to that buyer yet.
It ain't what it used to be. It used to be so simple. You had to like be okay with the IT people, but sell to the security people. And now in our space, the cloud team, which is a proxy for saying, developers and people who work with software-defined infrastructure may own security and partner with the security team and take the lead. And they have different needs. And then in some instances, the privacy team wants a little love because the security team and the cloud team do things for them. And, and so the security and cloud infrastructure team kind of wants you to help out the privacy team, even if they don't quite know the words all the time. And then sometimes the data team lifts their hand and says, "What are you going to do to my data? And can we get in on this? And maybe you don't really need this because we've got a project over here." It's really just a state of where organizations are right now. We have roles like chief data officer we didn't have before. We have chief privacy officers, which we didn't have before. We have privacy engineering. We have all sorts of roles in the cloud side where, which go by a bajillion different names. All this crazy acceleration of change is being reflected in the chaos we have with organizations and their structure. And it sort of defies easy explanation. And it's to say, like, if you go in expecting algebra, you will find trigonometry, and you better be ready for it. So yeah, it's fun, but you better be ready for it. You're piecing together a puzzle, and take it as an intellectual challenge.
Awesome. Thanks, Dave. Hey, we're coming low on time now, so we're going to do a quick lightning round. So I'll address this first one to Art. So the question is, Silicon Valley. Do you have to build a successful security company in Silicon Valley, or are there other places?
Oh, we need the advertisement for LA. We need all three of them. We need Dave, Andrew, and Art. We also love Silicon Valley, fun companies up there. We have friends up there, but hey, all three of you guys, give us the advertisement for why you'd build a company in Silicon Valley versus outside of Silicon Valley.
Go first.
Sure, Art, take it. Start us
off. So how I think about it is, obviously, for specific location to be, conducive to startups, you have to access to talent, entrepreneurial and other talent, access to capital, and access to markets, right? Markets, including channels. So I think that's not something unique that Silicon Valley has compared to the rest of the world. The only thing that's somewhat unique is the concentration of capital, which I think it is something that could flow anywhere there are great opportunities. But as far as talent, as far as markets and channels, I think Southern California, Northeast, Central states, there are locations everywhere on the map that you can find. So that's my take.
Yeah, do you have to be in Silicon Valley to be able to start a great company? God, no, like absolutely not. We sold our company for almost $1 billion. It was one of the best revenue multiple exits in the history of tech, not just in LA. And the talent that we had on our team that we were able to hire both in Silicon Valley and beyond. It's totally possible, and I'm sure Dave will touch on this as well because his team kind of reflects this more. But you give the rise of COVID, and you can hire people anywhere, and you can work remotely, just like we're doing this recording remotely. We're all over the place, even though we have sort of a heart in Southern California. So it's yeah, totally jumping the shark, I think, at this point. So
yeah, the answer isn't the Silicon Valley. The answer isn't Los Angeles either. The answer is to be thoughtful about how you build your business, and don't put your people all over the place. Like, be thoughtful about where you do it. I've experienced that. It sucks. But the ability, like we've had, to access infrastructure engineering in Seattle and up in the Bay Area, and real marketing talent down here in Los Angeles, and design talent and folks in the gaming industry that help us build beautiful 3D maps, and front end talent, like the ability to pull that together and be mindful of time zones because they matter a lot. But if you can grab a slice of, a time zone and pull that together, magic can happen. And I still think, though, much like, New York is the financial capital of the US, Silicon Valley will continue to be the tech center of the universe. And part of the great thing about Los Angeles, to come back to it, is you have very quick access to it, and it's easy to get down and back. I still think LA is the entertainment center of the universe. Like, that's cool. Like, we're happy to be here alongside them. It's fun to get out of it, but Silicon Valley is still going to be the throbbing heart of tech. It's nice to be a little bit outside of it, though.
Yeah, Dave, one just quick ad for you. I think one of the things that struck me when we met, and I think we all met initially at these things we used to do, dinners together in the real world.
Eating, that's right.
Yeah.
Which is actually the nice thing, like infrastructure dinners in LA and Southern California, where everybody, is trying to help each other and spans Bay Area to Colorado to DC. And so I think I think one of the things I love about the cybersecurity community is it is a community, it's kind of, it feels very welcoming, I have to say, as a woman in the industry too. Of course we need more, but it's very welcoming, quirky, kind of authentic industry, which I love being a part of now. But Dave, one of your first hires was a designer. And I remember that was something new and I hadn't seen that. It wasn't just a designer, it was a creative director. To me, that was a little bit of like CrowdStrike Tenable with some LA on the side. So, but
our first hire was a designer too, for sure.
Yeah. I mean, well, you said to me, and Andrew, I'm sure is the same for you, said that, when you walk the RSA floor, if you stand out a little bit differently than everybody else and you're building to a user who's delighted, you're just more likely to stick around and do good work. So anyway, last thing I'll say on this is one thing I've learned from all of you guys: work with people you enjoy working with wherever you find them. And I feel lucky that I get to work a lot with all of you guys, because when you look in your cap table, if you succeed, it's like, did you do it with people you enjoyed getting there with or not? And you don't always have that luxury, but I feel, I just have to say, really fortunate that I've had that experience with all of you guys. So last question, SolarWinds, evolutionary or revolutionary? I mean, really, how big of a deal is SolarWinds to the cybersecurity community and to companies? Some people say it's just an evolution of what's been going on and everyone's finally paying attention and it was bound to happen. And others say, well, listen, mass market awareness and understanding how much our supply chains were compromised is a real wake-up call, and it's going to fundamentally change the way we do business. So I'm just curious where you guys fall on that spectrum and whether you've seen any acceleration in your businesses as a result. And okay, I'll start with Andrew.
Same stuff, different day. It's like, honestly, the amount of like big hacks that happen over the last 10 years that I've been building a business around, like it's great because it's great in the sense that most people that are in the security industry know how unprepared we are, like overall. Most people outside of the industry do not, and they assume that we're particularly prepared. I think there is a bit, the only angle to that there might be a wake-up call is that I think a lot of people assume that our government like systems have great cybersecurity. I don't know that that's always the case. I think there's probably certain groups that are better than others, but the reality is everybody's vulnerable. Like, so I see it much more as an evolution rather than revolution.
It's one of the biggest hacks ever. But having said that, it's also evolutionary. Like, we knew supply chain hacks were possible. A whole bunch of people had posited that stuff like this could happen. SolarWinds has been around for a long time, has a big attack surface. It isn't shocking. I'm not going to say it was bound to happen, but it isn't shocking that it happened to people who've been watching this space. Very much evolutionary in that regard, but it's huge. I mean, the actual risk created by this is massive and almost can't be understated. So as like an indicator of like a seismic change, it is not. As a moment of profound risk where you look at it and you say, wow, that's truly kind of jaw-dropping. I think the negative side of it more than anything is the whole push over the last year into the cloud and digital transformation and all the changes we've been undertaking. We really need a big focus on just cleaning up after the madcap last 12 months we've had and all the mayhem afterwards. Like, we need to take care of our hygiene. We need to get some foundational things in place. Everything from proper authentication and good identity and data governance to like just baseline monitoring and visibility for people who just moved to the cloud. And now all of a sudden it's a drop everything and deal with the threat and worry about whether, they got in through SolarWinds. So I see it as a real, people looking and say, wow, this is going to be great for your business. Like, no, actually, like if you look at it for like a cybersecurity misery index, like this spiked the misery index dramatically, and that's not good for anyone.
Yeah.
If I may just add my 2 cents in here, I'm gonna go ahead and disagree a little bit. I'm doing the office space style.
Give it, Art.
But no, look, I hear you guys, right? So this is cybersecurity. Anybody's been in this space and been following the breaches, it just almost feels like yet another day, another breach. But here's what's different about this for me. A couple of elements of this were really the pieces that me and my co-founders have been talking about 4 or 5 years ago. That the exposure, the vulnerability is there, and yet it was not being sufficiently talked about. But it's also, if you look at like just from the magnitude standpoint, I don't remember any other breach, and you can name the biggest that you remember, but where outside of one organization, this many other organizations were impacted by that breach. So we're talking about thousands here. What this means to me is, if you're looking at it from the what could happen if something like this were to happen in, let's say, AWS, what would be the magnitude of that? 100,000 customers or tenants on AWS today. That could be like, what, 5 times more than the SolarWinds impact, right? So I think in a way that how you think about this, it's different.
Yeah.
But like but isn't that like open source software, right? Like when we find vulnerabilities in that, and Dave's co-founder knows this stuff very well because he started a company around it. Like you have a vulnerability in open source software, and it's probably bigger than the SolarWinds like vulnerability that came out. Every single time that there's a vulnerability that comes out in that, right? And they come out all the time. Like,
yeah. I mean, I do think one major difference from my perspective is just the number of people who are thinking about it and talking about it, the number of mainstream
Sure.
media articles, podcasts, et cetera. And so the awareness that goes all the way up to the CEO level. And I think you move from like one-off to inevitability around this. And so how does that change our business practices? I don't know. I don't think that there's one answer, chicken or egg. And so I actually love that these gentlemen who enjoy spending time together are disagreeing. And I'll just say, like, my hope is you have, I look at all three of you, some came from very traditional backgrounds, some came from less traditional backgrounds. And to me, as someone who kind of started getting exposure to this stuff in my early 20s and the late 90s, and then took a break and came back, it's one of the most interesting, not just tech areas, but policy areas, GDP areas. It's fascinating, and it can span all different backgrounds, all different people. The more we get our kids in open source projects playing around with this, pure developers interested in doing rotations on security teams. I mean, it's just, to me, I just love to inspire more people to build companies in this area, and more different kinds of VCs to invest in it, and not to pigeonhole themselves into, you know, a particular thing. I think it's one of the biggest value creators of our investing career. And, you know, I thank you, Andrew, for bringing me back into it and introducing me to these guys to your left on our screen. And today it's been a pleasure to spend time with all of you guys. And thank you guys for sharing your insights.